All right. Welcome to the February Calumet Revisited Forum. I am Michael Bowes of the Association for the Wolf Lake Initiative and co-host with Dr. Valerie Pennanen, Professor Emerita of History at Calumet College of St. Joseph. Forum is funded in part by the Indiana Humanities and the National Endowment for the Humanities. Before we hear from tonight's speaker, are there any announcements? If not, I have several. At the March 5th forum, David Dolak of Columbia College will be talking about the science of instrument making. And on March 27th at 3 p.m., there will be the second meeting on developing a plan for the Wolf Lake watershed. Both events are on Zoom. This is the 10th year of these Calumet Revisited forums, and there must have been at least 7 of them devoted to the underground.
Make sure you throw it here.
And during, can you remain on mute, please? And during this year, Dr. Larry McClellan has written 3 books on the subject. After his presentation, we will have a question and answer session. The presentation this evening is being recorded. Would you please remain on mute, except for Larry? And you can, I'm going to turn this over to you, Larry.
Okay. I'm delighted to be with you all. And my understanding is that Michael will be continuing to admit people here at the beginning. As he indicated, almost every year for a long time, I've been coming back here to talk with folks related to the Wolf Lake Initiative and Calumet College. And every year we've got another kind of evolution in terms of our activity and research on the Underground Railroad. I had done earlier 2 books on the Underground Railroad. And then this past September, my latest book called Onward to Chicago, Freedom Seekers, the Underground Railroad in Northeastern Illinois, was published by Southern Illinois University Press. And I'll do a little commercial about the book when we get to the end of Q&A. But what I'm going to try to do is shift and share a PowerPoint with you all. And Michael and I have tested this, so we believe this will work. So I'm going to, I will pull it up in a second. Just a little bit about me for those that you don't know. I am Professor Emeritus at Governor State University. I taught there for many, many years and actually helped to establish Governor State now 53 years ago. So I've been around the Chicago region and the Calumet region for, for a good long time, and have been working on my Underground Railroad research for about the last 25 years. And hopefully I'll be able to give you a kind of an overview and then fill you in on some of the things that we're doing much more recently. So we will try to establish a PowerPoint.
Okay.
Okay, did that happen for people?
That happened.
Yes.
Okay. Freedom Seekers, the Underground Railroad, and our latest project is called the Chicago to Detroit Freedom Trail. And it comes out of Chicago and out of the south suburbs. The 2 branches of it meet in LaPorte, and it goes on into Michigan. And I will be talking about this with you at, later on in my presentation. So anyways, what we have with the Underground Railroad tradition is we've got two great cycles of stories. We have stories about the freedom seekers themselves, those people that were able to escape from their enslavement in the South and made their way toward places of freedom. And we have a whole cycle of stories about the people that responded to them, the people that became what we know as the Underground Railroad. And so bear in mind, we have these two great cycles. Now, the dilemma is that until about 15 years ago, almost all of the energy and work was done on stories about the Underground Railroad, not on the freedom seekers. And so we really, I think the great challenge for us in this work is to really be looking at the stories of the people that actually had left their enslavement. And so part of what I'm interested in is a kind of a dramatic reframing of this whole discussion of how do we talk about this remarkable set of activities in the years before the Civil War. Now, very early on, this wonderful image was published in the Western Citizen in 1844. The Underground Railroad, the activities of freedom seekers moving toward their freedom really starts in the 1820s in Illinois and Indiana and continues up into the outbreak of the Civil War, 1861. But remember, although with this image and lots of other things, the Underground Railroad was not underground and it was not a railroad. Rather, it is that image that developed for those people that were building networks to respond to the freedom seekers. So we have a lot to reframe. And let me begin by saying, when the folks that we are talking about that left their enslavement, in the 19th century, they were referred to as fugitive slaves by the law and by the language. But we need to understand today that we continue to use that phrase, but that is a property category. Slaves were property. And what a number of us across the country are seeking to do is talk about folks as freedom seekers, to talk about their fundamental human intention. People that were enslaved in the South and who seized their freedom by any means necessary and headed in all kinds of directions in search of freedom. And so we prefer to talk about folks by their human intention, and that was to seek their freedom, but clearly understand these are the folks that in the 19th century were categorized as fugitive slaves. The second part of the reframing is to understand that the freedom seekers were the protagonists. Even today, much of the language of the Underground Railroad presents a network that is created by white abolitionists and some Black abolitionists that then kind of reaches into the South and ferries and pulls slaves out. And that is simply not the case. It was the movement of freedom seekers that engendered responses, and those responses became the Underground Railroad. A colleague of mine at the University of Buffalo, Professor Keith Griffer, says the Underground Railroad did not organize the freedom seekers, but was organized by their activity, by their arrivals. And so understand the Underground Railroad is that network of responding, not of initiation. The other part of the reframing of this story that, again, is desperately needed is to understand how remarkably diverse it was. Most of what we know, and for about 160 years, until about 15 years ago, essentially all the material written about the Underground Railroad was by old white men writing about old white men. And in fact, it was incredibly complicated. Not only were there a number of Black abolitionists involved, and in fact, in Chicago, the Black abolitionists were really in charge of the Underground Railroad by the 1850s, but also recognize that although we talk about the men, nobody could have been inviting people in their house if that had not been a family decision. And what I try to do in my books is try to always talk about the men and the women together doing this. So those people involved are remarkably diverse in terms of their responding to the movement of freedom seekers. And of course, the freedom seekers themselves are all people of African descent who are moving into a freedom environment. The other part of the reframing we have to do is that understand this is not just on the East Coast. You know, God bless Harriet Tubman, and it's great to talk about Harriet Tubman, but she was never in Indiana or Illinois. We have very great activity in our states, and we need to be, you know, really talking about that. So what you'll see reflected in what I'm talking about are these ways of reframing this story. So let me dig into it. To begin with, we can never forget the brutal reality of slavery, of people kidnapped in Africa, the horrific Middle Passage, and then coming to the United States and other places in the America and becoming property. I think today it is really difficult for us to even comprehend what does it mean that some people own other people. But there was this brutal reality of people owning each other. And we have to remember that because that helps us to understand the seriousness. Why were people escaping? They were escaping because of that brutal reality. And so as they escaped, where did they go? Well, in fact, freedom seekers went to Mexico, to the Caribbean. They commandeered ships on the East Coast. A number went to live with Native American people. We generally talk about the freedom seekers that went into the northern states. Now, I've used these blue lines to give you a sense of how people, the directions that people move. But looking at this map, please recognize that Missouri, Kentucky, Maryland, and Delaware are all on this map as slave states. They were, in fact, slave states, but they were not part of the Confederacy. And so part of the complexity of the Civil War comes from the fact that the Union was composed of free states and slave states. The other slave states, of course, had seceded from the Union. Also note on the map that Missouri has hundreds of miles of a border with the state of Illinois. And so it is no surprise that the bulk of the major number of freedom seekers coming into Illinois came out of Missouri. You know, folks could walk down to the Mississippi River and look across, and there was a free state right across the river. And so they did that kind of movement. The other thing to notice is of the red states, you will notice that Illinois and Indiana, to some extent, are further south than the rest of the Union. And in fact, the southern counties of Illinois are further south than most of the state of Virginia. And so in Illinois, we had this incredibly complicated situation that southern Illinois was really southern, and northern Illinois was really northern. And that, if you look at Illinois history, that's reflected in all kinds of interesting ways. So my research suggests that we see these estimates, that possibly 4,500 to 7,000 freedom seekers made their way into Illinois in the decades before the Civil War. And those coming to and through Northeastern Illinois were probably 2,500 to 4,000. And my research now suggests that coming through Northwest Indiana, where many of you are located, there were more than 1,700 freedom seekers that came either overland or by lake steamer or eventually by train. So there was a significant movement of people on their way to freedom in Canada. The great dilemma, of course, was that you couldn't be free unless you left the land of the free, particularly after the great Fugitive Slave Act of 1850. People of African descent anywhere in the country were in significantly greater danger. And although Chicago, in many ways, functioned as a sanctuary city, people's goal was to get themselves to Detroit. And what I've been doing recently with the grant from the Illinois Landmarks, the Indiana Landmarks group, is that we've begun to look at the movement of freedom seekers through Indiana. And it is a very different set of movements, meeting up in Michigan and then heading toward Detroit and freedom in Canada. So there were these two separate streams of people on the road making their journeys in the Indiana process and in Illinois. If we look at it, where were people coming from out of the South? A large number were coming out of the Mississippi River Valley. And that's a whole amazing story in and of itself. As I'd indicated earlier, the largest number in Illinois came out of the slave state of Michigan, and a variety of others came out of Tennessee and Kentucky. Some came straight overland, some came up the Illinois River Valley. There were a few that came overland out of Iowa and Kansas. And then that was separate from the movement of freedom seekers coming up through Indiana. And you'll see later in the maps, these two streams really don't meet until they got into southern Michigan, and I'll be talking a bit about that. And as they gathered in southern Michigan in a variety of ways, they headed toward Detroit, but they're heading toward freedom in Canada. Now, my focus has been on looking at Illinois and Northwest Indiana, these two, and there have been two great streams. There was a stream that went to and through Chicago, and a stream that bypassed Chicago. And as you can see from my map, this is from my book, by the way, both of those streams, of course, come right through Northwest Indiana. And now here in Illinois, in the Chicago region, in the Northeastern Illinois, I've identified about 60 sites where freedom seekers found assistance, with over 20 sites in what is now the city of Chicago. Across Northwest Indiana, at least 19 sites. But particularly here in Indiana, very few of these sites have been researched, very few have been recognized. We have across Northeastern Illinois about maybe a dozen sites that have been recognized as places of significance for the Underground Railroad by the National Park Service through their Network to Freedom program. Across Northwest Indiana, there are several sites that are eligible, but there is not a single Network to Freedom National Park Service site located in Northwest Indiana, and hopefully the work we're doing together will get some of that up and running. Now, to understand the networks across Northeast Illinois led folks to both bring freedom seekers into Chicago, but also freedom seekers on their own journeys made their way to Chicago. And Chicago always has had a Black community. In the 1830s, there were Black families, young Black families living in Chicago, and they were assisting freedom seekers. In 1838, a remarkable fellow named Louis Isbell, and nobody in Chicago has ever heard of Louis Isbell, one of the most absolutely remarkable leaders of early Chicago, and he just has not been in Chicago history. He was born enslaved in Kentucky. He may have been the son of his master, but that's not clear. His master and family and their slaves moved into southern Illinois, and when he was about 12 years old, Louis Isbell was given his freedom. When he was 19, as a young man, 19, he moved to Chicago and immediately got involved with assisting freedom seekers and was up to his neck in all of this for decades as people were coming through. A really remarkable fellow that needs to be remembered and honored. In the late 1830s, a group of young white families moved into Northeastern Illinois and into Chicago, and they began to be confronted by freedom seekers, and they began to realize they had to do something. Now, you need to understand that in northern Illinois and in northern Indiana, the people who were anti-slavery, there was a pretty large bunch not in the 1840s, not a majority, but a significant number. And they were saying slavery is bad, but it was a long way away. Among the anti-slavery opinion, there was a very small group of people who said, we have got to politically act to eliminate slavery. We have to abolish it. And they were the abolitionists. Now, among the abolitionists in northern Illinois and in northern Indiana, there was a tiny group of people who said, we will break the law to help these people gain their freedom. And that's the Underground Railroad. And the dilemma, part of the dilemma we have is that people often equate the abolitionist movement with the Underground Railroad, and that is not the case. The Underground Railroad was that group of dedicated people who decided, those families that decided, we will break the law because we have to help the freedom seekers. Now, in Chicago, 1845, 46, there are a number of reasons why this happened, but a remarkable group of young Black families came and they settled in Chicago. And by 1850, the early 1850s, these Black families were working with the white families, and essentially the Black families and their leadership were really in charge of the activities of the Underground Railroad. And so people of African descent who had escaped their enslavement and made it to Chicago were most often engaging with Black families. And that has simply not been part of Chicago's history. A lot of this has changed in the last 15 years, but for 160 years after the Civil War, essentially the Underground Railroad in Chicago was about white people who were helping the fugitives. And we really need to dramatically reframe that, because we now know that there were not only a variety of Black families involved, but also they were exerting significant leadership. And the key roles played by that Black leadership focused around two churches, Quinn Chapel, which still exists, and Zor Baptist Church, which became Olivet Baptist, which is still also on the south side. And we have a whole cycle of stories about kind of remarkable encounters of freedom seekers coming and meeting people from these churches. Now, going from Chicago, and bear in mind that Chicago was the size of the Loop. To get toward freedom, people went down the road to Detroit, and it goes straight south out of Chicago about 15 miles, because it has to get around the bottom of Lake Michigan, and of course come over into Northwest Indiana. As it does that, it goes through what was the early Dutch settlement we know as Roseland, and it went very near to the Dutch settlement that we now know as South Holland. And in the late 1840s, a number of young Dutch families came to settle, and they settled in what becomes Roseland and South Holland and along that trail. And part of our story revolves around two remarkable families, the family of Cornelius and March Kuiper and the family of Jan and Angie Tun. Kuiper's home was on at 103rd Street and Michigan Avenue, and the Kuiper's home was on the Little Calumet River. And here are pictures of Cornelius and Jan, and there's Jan and his wife, Angie. And our particular focus has been on the Tun farm site. This is a painting of what their farm looked like many years ago. The building is now gone, but the Kuipers and the Tuns were among the only people of the Dutch settlers that spoke English. And so Jan Tun and Cornelius Kuiper ended up being the main communicators with their European American colleagues and neighbors. And also they became the key communicators with freedom seekers who were on their way through. And we've got a great cycle of stories about Cornelius Kuiper and a cycle of stories about Jan and Angie Tun and the ways that they responded to and helped freedom seekers that were on their way to Detroit and then on to Canada. We've done a lot of work on the Ton Farm. It is now officially recognized as a listing on the Network to Freedom, which is a program of the National Park Service. In September of 2022, we unveiled a historical marker. This on the left is Lieutenant Governor Juliana Stratton. Next to her is Ron Gaines, who owns the marina on the Little Calumet River where the Ton Farm site is located. On the right side of the sign is Congresswoman Robin Kelly, Cook County Commissioner Donna Miller, my colleague Tom, and the fellow in the back is the Chicago Consul General for the Kingdom of the Netherlands. And they are very proud of the connections they have with this activity by Dutch settlers in the 1850s. Now, still focusing on Illinois, the other stream of movement bypassed Chicago, and it went straight east to go into Northwest Indiana on its way to Canada. And here's a picture of the Sauk Trail. The Sauk Trail was hundreds of years old, and you can see the path worn into the ground. And it was the great trail that reached all the way to the Mississippi River and then over to Detroit. And it came right through the south suburbs and right through Northwest Indiana.
Wow.
So along with freedom seekers going into Chicago and coming around the bottom of Lake Michigan, you also had freedom seekers that were coming in this Sauk Trail corridor a little bit to the south. Near that corridor, very near the Sauk Trail, was the location of the Crete Congregational Church. This building was built in 1853. The congregation was established in 1839 and was one of the first congregations in Illinois to issue a declaration declaring slavery to be a sin and that it must be fought against. And Crete became a real hotbed of abolitionist activity and a key center for the work of the Underground Railroad. And we know that hundreds of people came east along the Sauk Trail and related roads on their way across Northwest Indiana and onto freedom in Canada. This cemetery and the church itself also have been placed on the National Network to Freedom listings of the National Park Service. And again, remember, Northwest Indiana, there are none. We got to build those. We've got to create those, but the research is really hard, but I need your help. Okay, so we have these two streams. People that went to Chicago and then came around the bottom of Lake Michigan. And then there were people that came directly across Illinois. And both of these streams came to across Northwest Indiana, met and then met up in Canada. Now, we've been saying for years, well, of course, they went across Northwest Indiana and then Southern Michigan and then on to Detroit and freedom in Canada. But where did they go really? Exactly. How did they travel? What were the pathways? I've got these general patterns. And remember that roads in the old days shifted around. And so talking about routes is really tricky. But we started to do research saying, well, how is it that people made their way? How did they get from Northeastern Illinois across Northwest Indiana to Detroit, freedom in Canada? How do we begin to answer that question? So first of all, we began looking at what were the main corridors. There was, and we've already introduced you, the corridor of the Sauk Trail. This was hundreds of years old. It was used by freedom seekers probably as early as the 1820s as they were trying to journey to Canada. In addition, in 1825, the federal government established a military road from Detroit to Chicago. And for half of it, they followed the old Sauk Trail, and then at LaPorte, they went out toward the lake, and the original road, military road to Chicago, went right across along the lakefront on the beach. And they used to say that if you made it in a stagecoach in the early 1830s, if you made it to Michigan City, Michigan City, if the weather was perfect, you could be in Chicago in 6 hours because the horses and buggies and the stagecoaches could run on the beach like a paved road. However, if the weather was bad, it took 6 days, not 6 hours. And so they decided to move the Chicago road away from the lakefront. And that became very important in terms of our activities. So it comes right through Northwest Indiana and then crosses over into the south suburbs of Chicago. In addition to those historic pathways that then freedom seekers were using going east, we also know that in the mid-1830s, the state of Michigan created what they called the Territorial Road. And then over time in the 1830s, there were various roads that developed that connected all of this. So what we have is the beginnings of an understanding of freedom seekers going to Detroit traveled either on or fairly near these different roads as they made their way across. So as we began to think, how do we identify and commemorate the journeys of freedom seekers? And how do we recognize the Underground Railroad places that responded and helped them? We said, how do we develop it? How would connect the dots? So our tentative plan is to advocate for a national historic trail that goes across from Chicago to Detroit, following some of these old trail patterns, and that also includes a branch that follows the Sauk Trail and recognizes that there were these two streams of movement. So that is what we're trying to do to develop the Chicago to Detroit Freedom Trail, eventually as a national historic trail, and I need your help. So now let me tell you some details about this. First of all, here in Illinois, this historic trail will start at Quinn Chapel up in Bronzeville to honor the real contributions made by Black abolitionists who were the activists in the Underground Railroad in the 1850s, these young Black families working with young white families. Secondly, we want to remember the Sauk Trail corridor and the important activity in Crete, and on the Sauk Trail itself is the McCoy Homestead. We know that well over 100 freedom seekers received help from the McCoys, and they were literally right on the Sauk Trail. So coming from that, we then have the trail coming across Northwest Indiana. The upper route starts in Chicago. The Sauk Trail route starts in Park Forest and Crete. We also have some work to do. There was activity along the old Sauk Trail in Michigan, and we are having a fascinating time connecting with folks in northern Indiana all across the state. And I think we're going to try to develop a Northern Indiana Freedom Trail to link into all of this. So the prime example, some of you already know the story of Caroline Quarles, but a great example for Northwest Indiana is the activity of Caroline Quarles. Caroline Quarles, remarkable young woman. At the age of 16, she was enslaved in St. Louis in 1843. She was the child of her master's son and an enslaved woman named Maria. And when Maria was 17 years old, the master's son had his way with her, and the result was Caroline. So Caroline grew up in this household. And in 1843, she was 16 years old, beautiful young woman, pale skin, blue eyes, freckles, long black hair, and she was enslaved growing up in the household with her free cousins. Finally, at the age 16, she'd had enough. She used her skin color to pass as white, bought a ticket on a riverboat, went north to Galena. Slave catchers were immediately following her, went by stagecoach to Milwaukee, and then leaving Milwaukee, came down around the city of Chicago and across Northwest Indiana. She stayed overnight in Dundee, in Naperville, in Crete, and in Westville. And we've got details of her journeys across Northwest Indiana. And we know that there are great stories like Caroline's out there, and we need to uncover those and recover those. And I hope some of you might want to help. So along the Chicago Road, from going south out of the city and eventually going to LaPorte, each of those red arrows represents a place where we know freedom seekers found assistance. The same thing along the Old Sauk Trail, going a little bit further south. Each of those red arrows represents a place, a family, some kind of condition where freedom seekers were able to find assistance. So there's a lot of activity. At least 1,700 people came right through Northwest Indiana. Now, along that upper route, along the Great Chicago-Detroit Trail, there was help available in Hammond. It was called Homan's Bridge, a really interesting couple from Prussia. Also in the Holman area was a remarkable young Native American and Black woman named Kitty Gibson, and she may have been related to the family that ran the Gibson Tavern. This was a stop on the Underground Railroad right in the middle of Gary. This tavern was located at what is now 14th and Madison. Going further east along the road to Detroit, there were folks hiding out in the dunes. We've got evidence related to Chrisman and Chesterton and Tremont. There are, of course, the traditions, also with the rail lines going across Northwest Indiana. We've got evidence of activity in Michigan City, both with some families and with the depot. There's the remarkable story of Daniel and Mary Lowe, and currently it's controversial, but I think we will find the evidence. And then, of course, people went on to LaPorte. Now, the other stream, as it came into Indiana, again, there's the Sauk Trail, the old Native American trail. There's work to be done on the old State Line Hotel, now no longer standing, but it was the middle of Dyer, Indiana. In Maryville, there was the home of Dr. Henry Palmer, who was identified as helping escape slaves in the old language of the Underground Railroad. There were families in and near Valparaiso, the Williams, the Riggs, the Tanners. Remarkable set of stories around Westville. If any of you are connected to Westville and would like to dig into some things, there is a remarkable Quaker cemetery, the activities of Quakers and people in the Union Church. We just really have to do a lot of great work in Westville. Also, Westville was the home of the final resting place, the cemetery. It was the final resting place for Charles Osborne, who in the 1920s was one of the most famous Americans. He is really the father of American abolitionism, and I bet you none of you have heard of Charles Osborne. A really remarkable story, remarkable guy, and he lived the end of his life right here in Northwest Indiana. In LaPorte, there are a variety of families involved. Northeast of Detroit was a remarkable African-American settlement called the Bank Settlement, and would love to have some people doing further research on that. Now, what we've got is we're also developing the maps. And if we look at this, we realize, for those of you that know the Dunes area, there's the Bailey Homestead right in the middle of the map. That is the original road from Chicago to Detroit. What we're planning to do is to run the Chicago to Detroit Freedom Trail very close to that original line. And remember that we're also hoping to put some activity in Indiana Dunes State Park and in what is now Indiana Dunes National Park. And remember that along the lake is where freedom seekers traveled from Chicago in the very earliest days, in the 1820s, 1830s, and then the Chicago Road was moved inland. If we go up a little further, again, we can see the historic road from Chicago to Detroit, leaving the lake and going down to LaPorte. And it was there that it joined up with the old Sauk Trail. And what we are hoping to do is to put the Chicago to Detroit Freedom Trail right along that old route, original route, and then to hook up with the Sauk Trail route. And again, there are all kinds of places where we've got pretty good evidence that we need to research and find sites where freedom seekers found assistance. Here in LaPorte, we have remember the original Chicago Road, comes into Detroit, it meets up with the Sauk Trail, and the Sauk Trail goes straight northeast into southern Michigan. And we're planning to look at the Chicago to Detroit Freedom Trail, following that for the most part, and then going over to locate in South Bend to connect this set of journeys for freedom seekers with the set of journeys for freedom seekers that came up through Indiana and then joined up in Michigan. So we're looking to connect with that second stream that came up through South Bend and Bristol and other places in northern Indiana. And again, we know that there are places along the route where there was significant activity assisting freedom seekers. Now, a similar pattern with the Sauk Trail route. The original Sauk Trail follows what now is the old Lincoln Highway, but also is the location of the State Line Hotel, in Maryville, the Palmer Home, and other things. And we hope to run the Sauk Trail route along the old Sauk Trail, looking northeast of Valparaiso. You've got the small communities of Westville and LaPorte, which were on the old Sauk Trail. They hooked up with the Chicago Road in Detroit, and we want to run the version of our Freedom Trail following these old routes. And again, we know there are places of real significance and assistance. So looking across, we see the great, what we're calling the Great National Historic Trail, which we hope will someday be recognized, a couple of years, that this is comes across through Michigan City to LaPorte, and then all of it goes up. When we develop the actual Freedom Trail, as I'd indicated, we wanted to shift over through South Bend so we can honor the journeys of other freedom seekers. And we've got a wonderful working group in South Bend. And so as we are developing this Freedom Trail, we have a working group in Bronzeville in Chicago. We have a working group in the south suburbs. We have a working group in Northwest Indiana, a working group in South Bend, and we are now creating, with the help of the Michigan Freedom Trails Commission, the beginnings of a working group in Michigan. And we have a lot of work that needs to be done. It's very exciting. We're uncovering all kinds of information about the journey of freedom seekers. And remember, as I said, what we're trying to look at now is how do we commemorate those freedom seeker journeys, and how do we honor the places where they found responding people, which became the networks of the Underground Railroad. So there's lots of work to do in Northwest Indiana, and please contact us. Just now a small commercial, and then I'm done. In 2019, I finished these two books. To the River is the story of Carolyn Quarles. The Underground Railroad south of Chicago has a whole chapter on Northwest Indiana. And those of you that are in Northwest Indiana, it really is the most comprehensive putting together of the story. And the work we're doing with the Freedom Trail is building on that initial research that I brought together. And I mentioned that in September, Southern Illinois University Press published my latest book, Onward to Chicago. And if I may forgive me for being immodest, but there's an online newsletter called the Underground Railroad Free Press. It has a subscription base of 26,000. And at the end of 2023, they awarded me their 2023 award for the advancement of knowledge of the Underground Railroad. And they said in their citation that this book was the finest book yet written about the activities of the Underground Railroad. So I was deeply honored to receive the award and that they would say that about my book. Okay, I'm going to stop sharing and hope that I can respond to some of your comments and questions. Did my PowerPoint work?
Yes.
It did work. Okay, good. Okay, just, I'm always a little
Greetings, folks. How
paranoid.
are you all doing?
Hi, everybody. Okay, are there any specific questions you'd like me to explore? You have to unmute yourself or maybe
Excuse me,
wave or something.
I've got to go. I got to walk my dog.
Any question? I think someone's trying to ask a
Hey,
question.
how you
but we're not
doing?
hearing. Well, I'm doing great. Who is this? You're on, Blake, you're on mute.
You're on mute, like,
You're on mute, Blake, if you're trying to talk. You have to unmute yourself. There you go. You muted again. You've got to
Hey, y'all, how
unmute.
you doing?
There we go. Okay.
Hey, y'all, how you doing?
We're doing fine. Do you have a
I
question?
just want to ask you if there are any. I have a question. I just asked you if there.
Okay, I can't. I'm sorry. We can't hear your
Came
connection.
up here. I said, are there any descendants from Mississippi who came to the Calumet area years ago to settle up there?
Blake, I'm sorry. We can't hear your question. You're breaking up and you're freezing. Okay, let's try one final time. Try one more time, Blake.
I want to ask you any descendants from Mississippi who came up years ago.
We didn't hear your question exactly. Are you asking if folks came up from Mississippi?
Yes.
Okay, great. Okay. In fact, we know that there were not a huge number, but there were a number of freedom seekers. We've got the records now. Freedom seekers that came out of Mississippi, Louisiana, Arkansas, Alabama, and essentially they followed the Mississippi River Valley. And very early on in the 1820s, people knew to head toward Illinois and that they could find freedom in Illinois as a free state. And so we do have records of folks. I've got a couple just marvelous stories of that I've been able to find the stories of people in Alabama and Mississippi that made their way up to Illinois. So this is all new research, my friends. There is a lot of work to do to uncover these stories. It's deep research, but we've got a lot of fabulous stories to find. Any other questions?
in the chat room, there's some comments I can go through.
Okay, you want to read out the comments, Michael?
Okay. Okay, one says, great information. It is so exciting to learn of the rich history of the Calumet region. And wonderful presentation. So good to hear about the latest findings and ongoing research. That was by Valerie. I think the first comment. I can't read it.
Uh-oh.
Well, we may have lost, we lost you, Mike?
No, I'm okay.
Okay.
But that was it for the chat room, I think.
Okay. Somebody has just asked where the books can be found. During this month, I'm doing a lot of programs across the south suburbs, and had indicated to one person on I'll be doing a program in Calumet City on the evening of February 23rd. I'm going to be doing a program in Lansing on the evening of the 26th. I'm going to be doing a program at Calumet College at their Humanities Festival in mid-March. And you get the books directly from me at a good price, but you can order them through eBay for both the Caroline Quarles book and the Underground Railroad south of Chicago. And you can get my latest book, Onward to Chicago, is available through Amazon and also directly from Southern Illinois University Press. But I'd love to meet you and sell your books myself. Anything else?
There are a couple more questions in the chat from Alyssa and Mark.
Well, could you read those for us, Valerie?
Yes. Oh, well, now there's more. Okay. From Alyssa. Sorry if I missed this, but what does it entail to be part of the research working group? From Mark, do you know what groups are doing this in Southern Illinois? And also, what is your research strategy? Where do you start? And and a very warm compliment as well from Lois, who needs to leave, but really enjoyed the presentation.
Great. Okay, trying to respond to the questions. You are certainly welcome to contact me via email, and I keep forgetting to put that up, Michael. Can you? Well, all of you have connected with Michael, so if you contact Michael and say, how do I get to Larry, he will give you my email, and I'd be delighted to hear from you. And that'll be the best way to share with you the working groups, and our activity really will kind of take off again in April. We're having, during the winter months, we kind of take it easy, but I would be delighted to contact you. Also, you can find out about my programs if you go to undergroundrailroadproject.org. Okay. And again, that's Underground Railroad Project, one word, undergroundrailroadproject.org, which is the website for the Little Calumet River Underground Railroad Project. In addition, I've been appointed as one of 10 people to help establish the state legislature in Illinois has created a task force in the Underground Railroad. There are 10 of us across the state are developing strategies and will be developing recommendations on how the state should permanently be relating to this activity on the journeys of freedom seekers and the work of the Underground Railroad. As that is getting in place, I know a good deal about things around the state, but we really are going to be developing the networks around Illinois. Some of us tried about 20 years ago to build those networks, and that was before computers and before emails, and we couldn't build a volunteer network. Now that the state government wants to get involved, I think we'll be forming an Illinois Freedom Trails Commission, and hopefully it will have staff and resources to really help us keep digging into this information. Doing the research is really complicated. If you're interested in the specifics on the research, please email me. I've got several pages I can give you. I've developed a list of the potential sites in Northwest Indiana and across Northern Indiana. And I've developed a rather detailed research profile on what we need to know to really move this from mythology to reality. And the real history of freedom seekers, the real history of the people who responded to them is remarkable. We just have to dig it out, but it is there to be found. So please be in touch. And if you've got a particular research interest, I would want to connect with you and get these documents to you so you have a sense of research strategies that we're using. It's really complicated stuff. To put together an application to be recognized as a Network to Freedom site for the National Park Service is a boatload of work. Someone has asked, are there descendants of Yantan alive today to help the Dutch American community remember? Yes, there are. We have several relatives that are out of town that we work with the Ton Farm. There are several relatives in town, South Holland and Lansing, and we're delighted that we are working closely. We have groups of Dutch folk that come and visit at the Ton Farm. Anything else?
Excuse me, Larry. I just sorry for my voice. I'm just growing stuff for the Dutch American community and those who are Mississippi descent to help them remember their past in the Calumet region at my community farm on 89 South Mackinac. I work at a program called Urban Growers Collective. I've been a community farmer for more than 6 years.
Blake, that's terrific. I would love to have you. I've heard of your work, and I would love to connect. If you could send me an email note, and I'd love to know more detail about what you're doing. That's good work. Okay.
Any other questions?
Well, do you want to? Thank you all. Again, let me make my pitches. Please, if you're interested, we'd be delighted to have you volunteer and work with us. We are working with loads of volunteers. And secondly, if you show up sometime, buy one of my books. Okay? Thank you.
All right. Thank you for attending this evening's gathering, and we'll see you in March.
Himself. What this fool for himself. This fool.
Okay.
My
Thank you,
reputation.
everybody.
Okay.
You wanted with this fool, your salvation for that fool.
Somebody asked, let me repeat, it's undergroundrailroadproject.org. Or get your email from Michael. Okay, Michael.
All right. Thanks
Good
so
evening.
much.
Okay, we'll talk to you soon. I'll keep you up to date on what we're doing. Okay?
Okay.
All right, super. Bye-bye.
Bye. Okay. Can't see recording.